I hear it out of every investor's mouth. Janet Yellen preaches it as the gospel. Television shows like Mad Money and Lou Dobbs discuss it as if it's already happened, and Wall Street simply sits back and takes it all in. Of course, who can blame them? The stock market is booming, housing prices are finally creeping back up, and everyone keeps talking about how legitimate a recovery really is. It seems as though this year, 2014, will be the year the US economy finally comes roaring back. Unfortunately, nothing could be further from the truth. The US is not in recovery, the dollar is weaker than it has ever been in its existence, and we are headed for a currency crisis that will shake the US economy and the global economy on an epidemic scale. Since 2007, world debt levels have risen $30 trillion. And our own national debt has increased $6.89 trillion since Obama took office. In addition, only 28% of Americans like the direction this nation is headed, and median household income has declined for 5 years straight, while the cost of living has gone up. In January, according to the unadjusted numbers, the US economy lost an estimated 2.89 million jobs, a number that hasn't been seen since the peak of the recession in 2009. If we really are in a recovery, we would expect the data to be a lot better, but of course, we are far from it. The unfortunate reality is that not only are we getting sicker, but we are likely headed for the worst economic crisis this nation has ever experienced, unless we get things under control quickly. Despite the propaganda, endless money printing cannot create wealth, nor has it ever throughout any empire's history. Indeed, printing money can only destroy people's savings, as the value of the currency erodes over time, and consumers are able to purchase less with the same amount they were before. Recently, Janet Yellen, the newly appointed chairwoman of the Federal Reserve, announced she was going to taper the Fed's balance sheet by $10 billion every month, from $85 billion to $75 billion. The announcement temporarily sent Wall Street into frenzy, but stocks have since rebounded. I suspect that as the economic data, which has been very weak lately, grows worse, and investors finally wake up to the reality that the US economy is not in recovery, but rather headed for another recession, the Fed will have no choice but to increase the amount of quantitative easing every month to keep stocks rallying and investors happy. Of course, if the Fed does decide to ramp up the printing presses even more, we will see inflation get much worse, and the prices of everyday commodities, such as food, gas and energy, will go to the moon. Eventually, the inflation will get so bad that the Fed will be forced to raise interest rates, or the dollar will simply collapse under the weight of hyperinflation. To the naysayers, who say it can't happen, I strongly advise you look back at what happened to the Weimar Republic during the early 1920s, which is actually quite comparable to what is happening to the dollar and the US economy today. For example, by the end of World War I, Germany had amassed a staggering amount of debt, along with forced reparation payments given to them by France and other nations for the rebuilding of Europe. Germany could have managed these payments over a set period of time, but instead, the German government decided it would pay back its creditors sooner, but with devalued Deutschmarks. The German central bank, the Reichsbank, began printing obscene amounts of money, and by 1923 it cost 200 billion marks to buy a loaf of bread, compared to just 1 mark in 1918. This is just one illustration of what can happen when a nation is loose with its money supply. The one thing keeping the dollar afloat is the fact that it is the world reserve currency, meaning we are able to export a majority of our inflation. But what happens when the dollar loses world reserve currency status? I've outlined this in my previous article. 5 reasons the US is headed for an economic collapse. Basically, if the world, or even a single major creditor, were to drop the dollar, we would see inflation on an epidemic scale, as all of those trillions of dollars in reserves would come washing back to US shores. Already, China has said it is going to stop stockpiling US dollars, which is the first step towards dropping the dollar altogether. While there's no telling exactly what might happen, or when it might happen, it doesn't take an economics major to figure out the rest. Eventually, interest rates will be forced to rise to healthy market levels, and the government will be forced to default on its debt because 0% is the highest we can afford, or the Fed will keep up its quantitative easing scheme, and eventually the dollar will lose so much value that we will be forced to devise a new monetary system. Either way, it will end badly for the dollar, as sooner or later investors and creditors are going to realize the US is not poised for a recovery at all, but rather a complete restructuring of our debt and our monetary system. As far as if the US is in recovery, this is complete and utter hogwash. Sure, the stock market is rising, housing prices are creeping back up, and sure, all the so-called financial experts and economists keep preaching the recovery as the gospel, but every single one of them fail to see the bigger picture, that there is a much larger bubble that will prevent any legitimate economic growth from occurring until it is corrected. Sure, it will be painful, and we will likely slip back into another recession, but that is exactly what is needed to correct the imbalances that have been created by cheap money, 0% interest rates, and quantitative easing. The sooner we deal with our problems, the less the pain will be, and the sooner we can begin devising a new monetary system, hopefully one that is backed by gold and silver.